This is the story of when I sold all my belongings, picked up my bike, flew to Egypt, and decided to cycle across Africa. I thought it was going to be a tale of endurance and heat and pained thighs, but it really turned into something quite different to that. And this is that story. And of course, it starts in Egypt, at the pyramids. Where else? The adventure started on a cold desert morning at the Giza pyramids in Cairo. There are around 30 of us, cyclists from all over the world, nervously waiting to begin pedalling. Bikes were polished, lycra outfits were pristine clean, bodies were healthy and filled with food, and minds were ignorant of the tough times that lay ahead. The rolling desert sand stretched forever into the distance. 3 Toyota pickups drove up the access road to the pyramids. In the back of each were men with balaclavas, holding semi-automatic rifles. "That's our police escort," said the tour leader, Sharita, a tough South African woman with a casual blonde bob and a t-shirt that said, "Africa is not for sissies." "We'll be going through Cairo city centre, so you need to ride carefully." The group looked at each other anxiously. "Why are they wearing balaclavas?" I whispered to one of them. "Maybe because it's cold?" Cairo is a sprawling city of slums, skyscrapers, ancient mosques, world-class museums, and modern housing developments, home to over 16 million people. Behind a convoy of police cars and motorcycles, we passed directly through all of it, watched over by bemused locals cadging for lifts on the edge of the highway. I was struck by the large number of unfinished apartment blocks and the empty outer-town developments. The city was sprawling into the desert to find room for another 3 million people, yet was struggling to provide the relevant infrastructure and affordable housing. New Cairo, familiar problems. Soon the police escort left us. The urban sprawl rescinded, and we were alone with the desert. 11,980 kilometres of proper Africa left to go. The road was a pristine concrete highway, empty aside from the occasional rickety van or cement truck. Our tyres glided over the surface, helped by the presence of a benevolent tailwind. The road had been partially funded by the Chinese, and their motivations became clear as we passed vast quarries and mines, and trucks with Mandarin symbols filled in minerals to transport back to the homeland. Our first campsite looked like the kind of place people had taken to be shot. It was a ravine on the side of the road and had a line of rectangular hollows dug into the sand. Sharita decided it would make excellent protection from the desert wind. I now had to come out to the group about my adventuring inadequacy, in the fact that I'd never been camping and had never put up a tent on my own. I laid out a good patch and then slowly started to attach toggles into loops and force pegs into the hard ground. After an hour of faffing into the wind, my tent looked like a bin bag attached to a twig. One of the other cyclists came to help me out. Nate was a slim, well-groomed lawyer with blonde hair, glasses, and the physique of a dancer. "Do you want help?" he asked, his voice confident, masculine, tinged with Midwest US accent. I hate to say it, but yes, I thought I had this, but it doesn't seem to be working the same as in the back garden at home. Nate dexterously threaded the tent poles through the grommets. You mean you didn't camp in this tent yet? I mean, I set the tent up in my back garden to see how it worked, but I have to admit, I'm not much of a camping expert. But I'm not an expert? I've never set up a tent before. I watched as Nate staked a few pins in the ground and pulled the tent up. I've never cycled more than 50 miles before, he said, so we can probably help each other out. It's a deal. He gave me a supportive smile. See you on the road tomorrow. The next morning, we had our first 100-mile ride. I waited for Nate at the start, and we rode gingerly onto the highway, stiff and sore after our first day on the bikes. The road glided through the seaside resorts of Hurghada and Safaga, past eerie housing developments with Western names such as Santa Claus. It was clear that the decline in the tourist industry had led to the abandonment of many projects, leaving Egypt with little option but to sell off more of its own natural resource. To take our minds off the long cycling day, Nate and I discussed name for our bikes. Whilst most of the cyclists were riding purpose-built touring machines, our bikes were rather more modest in design, and this seemed to engender them with a certain personable character. Simon, said Nate, after Simon and Coley. Who's that? I said. He was one of South Africa's most important gay and anti-apartheid activists. After years in jail, he organised the first gay and lesbian pride event in the country. He gave a speech where he said, "I cannot be free as a black man if I'm not free as a gay man." I'm writing to raise awareness of LGBT rights in Africa, and I think he's a good example of the perseverance required for the trip. My bike was a 2013 Trek 7.3 FX Hybrid, which, according to the manufacturer, was perfect for commuting and the occasional off-road use. And I was riding for no cause except my own ambition. I don't know if I can provide an equally profound moniker, I said. Nate thought to himself for a minute. The Australian rider Will thinks you look a little like Prince William, so maybe we can come up with an appropriately regal title. I'm not sure how happy I would be about riding a princess every day. How about the Duchess? I looked down at the glinting silver frame of my commuting bike, gliding serenely through the desert air. The Duchess. I like it. The azure waters of the Red Sea slowly faded as the road carved a twisting path into the desert mountains. It felt good to head back into the Sahara, the pristine soul of the country, where the rules of the market economy didn't seem to apply. 8 hours of cycling complete, we made it into camp, and were pleased to know that we were not the last of the riders to arrive. We lay our bikes on the ground and stood and cheered each straggling cyclist in. Then we celebrated as a group with an enormous pasta dinner. Camaraderie still intact, for now. Nate and I stayed up a little late and shared a hot chocolate and the panoramic desert view. In the distance, oil rigs glimmered on the Red Sea, sucking up more natural resources to quench the world's need for fuel. It felt like we were beginning to separate from this world. Our lives a simpler, subsistence existence of tents, food, bicycles, and wonder at the desert night. The next day, Simon and the Duchess rolled down the desert road towards the banks of the River Nile, which we would follow on its life-giving path through the Sahara. Approximately 90% of Egypt's population lived on the banks, making it a stark contrast to the emptiness of the desert. As we rode, we were joined by running children, farmers leading donkeys, trucks piled impossibly high with tottering stacks of wood and sugarcane. The kids waved and yelled at us. It was celebratory, yet disconcerting at the same time. At lunch, I wolfed down my usual 5 cheese sandwiches, while shabbily dressed children peered at us through the palm trees. Nate noticed my concern and gave an understanding nod. We have to eat, don't we? But you feel that these kids are much hungrier than we are. I munched away without offering much in response. As a gay man, Nate was perhaps more conscious of social inequality than I was, or at least more able to vocalise it. We finished our lunch and cycled away in silence, the children from the village watching us through the trees. The next stop was Luxor, and we became typical white tourists, visiting Karnak, the Temple of Queen Hatshepsut, and the Valley of the Kings. Nate took a hot air balloon trip, ever the adventurer, while I walked around feeling mild unease as a resident of the UK, seeing an occasional missing head or plinth, and knowing that it sat in prime position at the British Museum. Would this be the same for the whole trip, as I stole elements of Africa from my own stories or photo albums back home? What was I hoping this continent would give me for all this effort and toil? The answers were not forthcoming. As the days wore on, we cycled further into the desert, and the heat of the afternoon started to increase. An afternoon Coke stop soon became invaluable. I would never consume fizzy drinks at home, but in a tiny Saharan village, Coca-Cola was pretty much the only cold product available. At the end of most days, I felt like passing out, but distracted myself by listening to Nate conversing with other riders about subjects such as gay rights in America, the death penalty, and the recent history of Egypt. His studious oratory challenged me to think about where I was and what the trip meant in the wider context of the continent. But the effort of the cycling meant I found limited coherent answers. Only sleep. We took a day's rest in Aswan and visited the bazaars and mosques. The bustling streets, exotic spices, and street hawkers ticked all my North African expectation boxes, but filled me with a certain emptiness. The hawkers eyed us with suspicion. The bars were quiet, and even the feluccas lay bobbing, unused, against the bank of the Nile. There were clues and snatches of conversation. The government is driving away tourists. The dam has damaged the river. There is no work for the people. I bought a number of souvenirs and a good helping of local shawarma. It seemed like all that a tourist could do. Rested, re-energised, and still questioning, we cycled along the long desert road to Lake Nasser, the gateway to the old Nubian Empire. The vast temple of Abu Simbel loomed in the distance, 4 colossal statues of Ramses II carved out of the rock, overlooking the lake with the overwhelming strength of Egypt and its kingdom. The temples were beautifully preserved, carvings and hieroglyphics almost intact from their creation around 1200 BC. The next morning, Nate and I rose early and headed to the temple for sunrise. I readied my camera while Nate stood with his hands behind his back, contemplating the scene. As the rays of orange light shone over the gargantuan stone pharaohs, Nate spoke softly to himself. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions red which yet survive. Stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty in despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." Nate turned and gave me a half smile. "But don't despair, Ozymandias. No power lasts forever, and the sun may rise on a world even more beautiful than the one on which it's set." We walked slowly away and looked for some breakfast. Sudan. At the border into Sudan, the gate was locked and no one could find the key. Two men in army uniform spent a long time arguing before a third man in a suit drove up in a Mercedes and handed them a wad of keys. There was much amusement from the group. "Still far more efficient than passport control at Heathrow," I said to Nate. "Much simpler than the US," said Nate. We were then given a military escort into the border town of Wadi Haifa, announcing our presence far more conspicuously than had we simply cycled alone. The town felt instantly hospitable, with locals in white robes smiling and offering us cups of fresh tea. We embarked into the main square for dinner and found muscular men smiling and beckoning us into ramshackle restaurants, with lines of chickens outside roasting on spits. Inside, our plates were filled with spiced meat, more than even a hungry cyclist could consume. The restaurateurs were concerned that their dishes would not suit our Western appetites, and made every effort to check we were okay, or offer us alternatives, unaware that these protein-heavy feasts were exactly what our aching cycling muscles required. We tried to tip with our newly acquired Sudanese pounds, but were immediately given the money back as change. The meal had probably cost us the equivalent of $1 each. Sudan was the first country where the mosquitoes had a risk of carrying malaria, and in my tent that evening I reluctantly tucked into the first of my pills. The tour organisers had recommended bringing an array of health products: painkillers, Imodium, rehydration pills, more diarrhea medication, and I had so far kept these stashed in the bottom of my bag, confident I'd never have to use them. However, malaria was unavoidable. I downed my required dose and then rested down for the night. Despite the horror stories about hallucinations, my sleep was disturbed only by the snoring of the other riders and the occasional braying of a donkey. Maybe the drugs did work after all. We left Wadi Haifa and were soon back in the desert. The area north of Khartoum was Sudanese gold mining country, and the land was a series of rocky escarpments, fenced off and labelled with threatening signs. Sudan was a country rich in mineral resources, but there was much dispute about the ownership of land, and amateur mining was a risky business. On the road, we were passed by jeeps packed with prospectors, many holding guns. Nate and I observed our usual policy of smiling and waving, and most of the men responded with smiles back. Some even allowed us to ride behind them, protecting us from the desert wind, and they laughed as we pedalled desperately to keep up. Clearly our pink light was not deemed much of a threat. A few more days along the desert road led us to Dongola, a bustling market town on the west bank of the River Nile. It was full of powerful-looking men with muscular torsos, and scores more cafes with spit roast chickens out front. We parked our bikes and went to take in some of the local cuisine, which turned out to be more plates of spiced chicken and very little else. It explained the protein-fueled physiques. Nate made conversation with some of the locals in Arabic and told me that their general comments were they will not try and sell us anything because they are not Egyptian. Like Nate, I didn't have too many problems with precious selling in Egypt, but there was no doubt that Sudan was refreshingly relaxed. Having had our fill of poultry, we took a slow ride back to our campsite. A couple of teenagers ran alongside us. "Hey," they said. "Hey you, nice bikes." We smiled and slowed down. The shortest of the three approached us with a sheepish look. "My friend is very poor, and he says he would love to have a bicycle like yours." We made apologetic faces and told him we didn't have any money. Then I noticed his friends smiling and waving from the side of the road. "Only kidding," the kids said. "We don't want your crappy bikes. Just a photo of you on our phones." We spent the night camping at an abandoned amusement park by the River Nile. The large quantity of meat gave me lurid dreams about being stuck on a carousel. I woke up and took some paracetamol. The reliance on drugs was only just beginning. During the day, temperatures were approaching 40 degrees C, and to cope, we went for swims in the River Nile. It was supposed to be full of leeches and bilharzia, but the cooling water more than counterbalanced the risk. People have been doing this for thousands of years, so I didn't understand what the problem would be. Suitably cooled, Nate and I dried off together on the bank. "They say once you drink from the Nile, you're destined to return," he said. "What happens if you swim in it?" I asked. "I think then you will never properly leave." "I don't think I'd mind that too much." "Me neither," said Nate. Slowly our Western white-collar lives were being washed away, flowing back towards the Mediterranean and into the sea. The road turned away from the river and headed straight into the boiling cauldron of the bone-dried desert. On the bikes, we were able to work up a breeze, but even this parched our skin in minutes. Occasionally we came across a village with welcoming shade and a tiny shop selling coke, but these were few and far between. In one such establishment, Nate and I sat, swigging, on endless bottles of water. A group of locals sat on the other side of the room, looking over to us. One of them gestured to us for a chat. They spoke in Arabic, which Nate was able to understand. I gained from the expression on his face that the conversation was not as genial as we were used to. What are they saying? I asked him. They are asking if we are Muslim, he said, and that Sudan is a Muslim country. I smiled at the men and bowed respectfully, thinking about our fellow riders bearing swathes of skin in their t-shirts and lycra shorts. Sudan is a beautiful country, said Nate to them in Arabic. The men nodded suspiciously. We quickly finished our drinks and left the cafe. It was a difficult issue. Sudan is a country that abides by Sharia law, with strict rules. Women who did not dress modestly could be publicly whipped. Non-believers that refused to convert could be imprisoned and even given the death penalty. Homosexuals could suffer even worse, something which I was too sheepish to even discuss with Nate. However, at the same time, we were visitors to the country and were acting in complete ignorance of local custom. We could expect suspicion at least. At the campsite that evening, there was a skeleton of a dead camel. Temperatures at night were touching 40 degrees. In order to help morale, I composed a song to the tune of Spice Girls' Wannabe, the Coke Stop song. If you want to get to Khartoum, you've got to stop for a Coke. Making times for sociopaths, Coke is for your friends. If you want to get to Khartoum, Coke's the only way. Beer's against the law, and so is being gay. So what do you think about that? It's like the 1920s. Damn you, Sharia law. I'm thirsty. I'm thirsty. So don't go wasting. No precious time. Get off at the Coke stop, and we'll have a gay old time. Nate provided a more sophisticated alternative, using his astronomy background to point out the constellations and galaxies that lit up the night sky. The desert may have felt oppressively hot during the day, but in darkness it was a place of peace and meditation. A simple visage of sand, sky and stars that calmed the senses and humbled our thoughts into wonder. I felt more at peace here than anywhere else on earth. The temperatures continued to rise, and the cycling became increasingly arduous. The road was an energy-sapping morass of sand and gravel. We camped as close to the Nile as possible, accepting the invasion of flies and mosquitoes as suitable pain for the luxury of a cool bath. After the final day of cycling through the Sahara, I passed out during dinner. Hot soup and hot water was simply not enough for my body to rehydrate. I spent the night throwing up, which Sharita kindly dealt with by moving my tent 50 centimetres away from the vomit. Fortunately, we then had a 2-day break in Khartoum, where we were camping in the grounds of a 4-star hotel. I booked a room and lay in the bathroom being sick, while some of the other American cyclists berated the staff for the high price of chips and the charges for towels to use for the swimming pool. First world problems all round. The next day I began to feel normal again and joined Nate on a visit to the tomb of Hamid al-Nil, a Sufi leader from the 19th century. Every Friday, Sufis gathered at the tomb to pray and dance, attaining a connection with God by engaging in frenzied chanting and twirling, and the spectacle always drew a large crowd. As the Sufis whirled around manically, I was reminded of my friend Nick from Boston who used marathon running as a means to communicate with his dead brother. Different world, similar principles. Religious fervour travels a long way. Khartoum was a difficult city to comprehend. By the Nile there were wide tree-lined promenades, grand hotels, and the presidential palace. Further into the interior, there was an endless grid of small streets with garages and shops, mostly quiet but for ubiquitous groups of men hanging around with nothing to do. In the centre of town was the vast Souk Arabi, an open market that covered around 5 city squares, full of people, products, animals, clothes, and general madness. We drove past the new presidential palace that was constructed by a Chinese firm and opened only 3 days previously. The opening was timed to celebrate the 130th anniversary of the Mahdi's overthrow of British rule in Sudan, when the British commander, Lord Gordon, lost his head on the steps of the old presidential palace. Another wonderful legacy of British rule, I said to Nate. At the confluence of the Blue and White Niles, we walked over the bridge to take pictures, but were ordered to put our cameras away until we would be arrested if we disobeyed. On the way back to the hotel, we were drawn into a brand new American-style shopping mall, the promise of 3-scoop ice creams proving impossible to resist. It's hard to know if colonialism has ended or is beginning again, said Nate, as an unlikely number of white faces walked past us. It's either colonialism or globalism, I said, or Americanism in an Islamic state funded by China. A collision of cultures and politics in the hottest city in the world. It was difficult to take it all in. We left Khartoum and headed off-road into Dinda National Park. This was an area that was abandoned by humans after a famine in the late 19th century and was now a fertile ground for sorghum crops, cheetahs, leopards and ostriches. The temperatures rocketed to 50 degrees C and the road was rough and corrugated. Nate and I cycled together, talking and singing our way through the challenging terrain. I sung Fields of Gold by Sting. He sung Desperado by the Eagles. Both felt equally appropriate. We came across roadside stands selling water, coke and tea. Visions of heaven to parched cyclists. We bought 10 bottles each, downing 4 or 5 in one go, and filling our travel bags with the rest. The vendors looked at us like we were crazy. "Why don't you cycle at night?" one said to Nate. In this level of heat, the suggestion did not seem unreasonable. The next few days were the most physically challenging of my life. The mornings were spent forcing the bike through sand and corrugated gravel. The afternoons cycling and trying not to pass out. The nights sleeping in 30-degree heat, a hot breeze blowing through our tents. And yet the rewards were exceptional. The villages we cycled through were untouched by outsiders. Women in colourful dresses laughed at us. Farmers in white gowns stood bemused. Yet everyone was happy and accommodating. Fields of sorghum surrounded us, shimmering with gold. How many foreigners do you think have ever had the privilege of seeing this part of Sudan? Nate asked, as we stopped to drink water in the sweltering heat. It can't be many, I said. Around us, the golden fields stretched in unbroken waves underneath a flawless blue sky. It was beautiful in its purity, but also from the effort that it had taken for us to get there. We knew that this moment was the only time in our lives that we would stand in that exact place. No matter what else happens on this trip, this is enough, said Nate. I hope so, I said. Finally, we made it through the last gravel track and arrived at the border with Ethiopia. The women wore tight t-shirts. There was beer, loud music, prostitutes, and noise everywhere. The Muslim world was over. Welcome back to Christianity. Ethiopia. Ethiopia was expected to provide the toughest cycling on the trip. It was a mountainous land, with peaks close to 6,000 metres. The roads were rough and corrugated, and the locals were supposed to be inhospitable to tourists. Given the only previous aggression I'd had cycling was from unhappy sheep, I felt somewhat unprepared for the challenge. The first couple of days involved a climb up into the highlands, then a rest stop in the city of Gondar. The years of attempted Italian occupation meant that the roads were good, and I confidently pedalled up the steep inclines, stopping occasionally to observe the vast scenery of Auburn Rock. Nate followed, and we rode strongly away from the group, our slim, athletic physiques ideally suited to the mountain terrain. Then, from nowhere, a stone struck the side of my bike. "Hey," said a child's voice. You. I turned to see a group of children running out of a farmhouse, hands clamped around stones, rocks and sticks. Farangi, they said, dispatching more rocks firmly towards us. You. Nate and I cycled quickly onwards, stones thumping on the road behind. Then we noticed more kids running through the fields. You, Farangi. They stopped to pick up more stones. Let's keep going, said Nate. We'd heard about the difficulty of cycling through Ethiopia. The charity fundraising of the 1980s led to many agencies visiting the rural areas of the country and providing children with gifts such as sweets and pens. Since then, the expectation of this had remained. The white man was associated with giving, and when this generosity was not maintained, there was a feeling of resentment, hence the stones. By lunchtime of the first day, Nate and I felt like partridges on shooting day. It was going to take new levels of reserves to get through the next few weeks. We camped in a mountain village and awoke the next morning with renewed vigour, the thought of a few stones vastly outweighed by the promise of the sublime rocky landscape. However, when I emerged from my tent, the camp was looking less optimistic. Two of the riders had contracted serious gastroenteritis and were walking around like zombies as they tried to pack their tents away. Then another took 2 spoonfuls of porridge before running off to be violently sick in the trees. The rest of us looked around gingerly. I was about to tuck into a second helping of porridge when a bee landed in my bowl. Then another and another. I turned around to see everyone jumping out of their chairs and waving their hands around vigorously. Beside the vomit and emaciated figures, a plague of bees had now invaded the camp. If I was writing a Bible, this would be considered to be a bad sign. Nate and I packed up our tents and rode swiftly out of camp. Somehow on the road, everything seemed like it would be okay. The day was long, and with every calf-busting climb, small children would run alongside us, throwing gravel. You, they say to us. Money. Why you go? Why you go? Said Nate out loud, as we neared the end of our first 1,000-metre ascent. That is a very philosophical question. Why do we go anywhere? The child stopped and gave a long, solemn look. Give me a pen, he said in response. Sometimes we did stop to give the children some sweets, even though we knew this was the wrong thing to do. People here were poor in Western terms, but still lived a self-sustaining subsistence life. Introducing sugar into their diet was no way to help. We reached the mountainous city of Gondar at around 4 p.m. after 9 hours in the saddle. It was humid, and the city was bustling with school coaches, trucks and tuk-tuks. The air was choked with gasoline fumes. Try as we might, we couldn't find our hotel, and energy levels were reaching a nadir. Then Nate noticed a sign to a road that led up a steep hill, where a glamorous hotel sat on a beautiful viewpoint overlooking the city. Another 500 metres up, our camp for the night. I pedalled fast, reaching the top of the hill in only a few minutes, then lay on the ground in front of the hotel and put my face down. A few minutes later, Nate joined me. Our nurse, Jodie, came and found us and bought us both a Coke. Nate took a few sips and then got up and started talking jovially. I felt like I couldn't move. 2 hours later, I was in bed, hallucinating. The fever grip in the camp had found me, and it was worse than I could have ever imagined. For the next 24 hours, I couldn't be more than 5 metres from the toilet. The rest of the cyclists were similarly afflicted, and the hotel rooms were full of the groans of vomiting riders. God knows what the staff must have thought of these visiting Ferengis. Luckily, we had a rest day in Gondar. So the morning after next, after a tentative breakfast, I was back on the bike. Africa doesn't wait for you, gastro or no gastro. We cycled on into the highlands, the landscape turning from arid desert rock to lush pastures, and then to deep forest. At one point, our campsite felt like a scene out of a Centre Parks brochure, until some local kids turned up and threw some stones at us. The highest point of the trip at 5,500 metres was celebrated by a bottle of Coke outside a cement factory, before a steep descent into the Blue Nile Gorge. Nate and I had become tolerant of stone throwing. However, when speeds on the bike dipped above 40 miles an hour, it became a rather more perilous prospect. Nate broke the record for the slowest descent of the gorge in history, while I was not very far ahead. On the way back up, though, the mountain goats were back with a vengeance, and this time no one clapped at the top. How to get fit in Ethiopia. A few hundred miles later, we were in Addis Ababa, gorging on the national dish of injera, large teff pancakes covered with dollops of stew and salad, and downing bottles of St. George beer. I was still slightly sick, but had grown used to it, and Addis was such a vibrant and exciting city that it was impossible to resist. The centuries of fighting off colonial invaders had given the locals a huge sense of pride and independence. The city had grand historic buildings, the Mikado, the largest and possibly craziest open-air market in Africa, a world-class museum with the skeleton of the first human, Lucy, a lively nightlife, and the best coffee in the world. While some cities tried to resemble New York or Paris, Addis was very much its own place. We ate and drank with gusto, and I was given a birthday cake by some of Nate's friends, one of whom felt like the most attractive woman I'd ever met. It had been a long time in the desert. Then it was back off into the countryside, along with raining stones, impassable roadworks, and more perilous descents. I wouldn't have had it any other way. Ethiopia has a wonderful variety of natural landscapes and people, and to the south of Addis, where the road descended into the Great Rift Valley, this became even more pronounced. One day we were camping by a lake in the company of marabou storks and pelicans. The next we were in deepest savannah, with ostriches prancing around our tents. Then we were back into lush pastures, stopping for a lunch at a local winery. The only constant were the shouting children, hills and roadworks. Nate and I cycled together, maintaining our sanity by discussing novels and which of the riders might be shagging. Our legs may have been suffering, but the richness of the landscape kept our minds energised and happy. The same could not be said for the rest of the group. At camp there was a mutiny, with riders claiming that they were under attack and that they wished there would be another famine. Fatigue can affect all of us in different ways, and children throwing stones does not help, but perspective is a wonderful thing. These were kids. We were the equivalent of the circus coming into town. They'd had years of charities providing them with gifts of sweets and pens. If I saw a cyclist speeding past and chomping down a Snickers, I'd be tempted to throw something too. Tension simmering, we left the farmlands and headed back into the rocky desert to the border with Kenya. There was one more day camping in the grounds of a frontier town called Yabelo, and then we were over the border. I feel like this has been the hardest and the best month of my life, I said to Nate as we sat in the shade of a concrete pipe left over from an unfinished construction project. Me too, said Nate. Is there anything you missed from home? I left someone a year ago, he said, when I moved to South Africa. A guy called Stephen. I still miss him, and many things about our life in Salt Lake City. You were together? I said. We were, then we broke apart. He was tied to Salt Lake, and I had a new position at the Constitutional Court in Johannesburg. And now I'm here. I'm not sure what will happen now. He might be dating someone else. And I don't know how I feel about everything when we reach Cape Town. I don't know if I'll be ready to return to Utah, or even leave Africa. Yeah, I said, I left someone in the UK as well. It wasn't too serious, but I still think about going back to see her when the journey is over. Were you in a relationship? Asked Nate. I thought so, but I'm not sure she felt the same. Maybe she's with someone else now, I don't know. We sat in silence for a few minutes, contemplating our emotional pasts and futures. A small lizard ran out of the pipe and scuttled over the deep red sand. There's still a lot of time to figure this out, I said. Who knows what will happen between here and Cape Town? Nate stood up and took hold of his bike. And who knows what will happen with Simon and the Duchess? I don't think we can break them apart anytime soon, that's for sure. Exactly. Only a half marathon left to camp. Let's get going. The campsite was in the grounds of a cheap hotel on the side of the desert highway. A foul drainage pipe ran alongside the designated camping area, and by the smell was clearly leaking. I lay my tent gingerly on the grass and was about to step inside when a few cockroaches crawled from under the canvas. I looked around, but all other suitable pitching sites were full. There was nothing else to do but put up with it. I took the final part of Ethiopia off my map, said goodnight to Nate, then went to sleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up needing the toilet. I went outside to find a quiet area, but found most of the hotel grounds still full of late-night revellers. There was no option but to use an outhouse, from which the aforementioned sewage pipe seemed to originate. It was pitch black inside and smelt rancid. I brought my bike light with me to make sure I didn't add to the stream of effluent swilling around the floor, and flicked it on. It lit up a cubicle covered in shit and crawling with flies and cockroaches. I flicked it off and then went as quickly as I could. Then I ran back to my tent. I didn't think I'd ever feel clean again. The next day, my stomach gurgled as I slogged the 80-mile cycle to our campsite near the border. It was another unforgiving place, a grey dust bowl, but was at least better than the hotel. I ate some dinner, then had an early night. However, it was not long before I was out of my tent, producing all the worst possible effects of severe gastroenteritis. At least the ground was pretty good at soaking it up. Ethiopia, you got me in the end. Kenya and Tanzania. The north of Kenya is one of the most remote environments on Earth. The land is formed out of the volcanic rock of Mount Marsabit and surrounded by the bare and salty Chelby Desert. Very little vegetation can withstand the hostile environment, so the surroundings are red rock, desert, and little else. I was lacking energy from the sickness of Yabello, but was still determined to get back on the bike. Nate cycled with me, and we passed the time by discussing the various sexual merits of our fellow riders. We agreed that until now, desire had been pretty much off the agenda, but that something in us had started to stir, and there were a few attractive bodies walking around to keep us entertained. On the side of the road, men swept sand away from the concrete. In the dry, arid wind, it was as unforgiving a task as I'd ever seen. The first settlement we reached was Marsabit. It was a frontier town with a sandy main street and groups of men in bars checking out the strangers who'd appeared out of the desert. In our lycra jerseys singing Ghost by Ella Henderson, we were the gayest two amigos in town. We spent the night camping at a convent outside of the centre. The nuns were savvy to the needs of Western visitors and laid out a feast of biscuits, chocolate bars and ice cream, all for £1 each. That new statue of the Virgin Mary isn't going to pay for itself, said Nate. The next day, the landscape changed again. We climbed up the sides of Mount Marsabit, and the temperature dropped. This gave rise to green foliage, lakes, rain, and even elephants hidden in the bush. We cycled along mud tracks and through remote villages, watched over by Maasai tribesmen and women on the roadside. Here was another vision of the Africa of my imagination, and I was as excited as if I'd encountered a gorilla riding a giraffe. I asked one of the Maasai women if I could take a photo. She agreed, then asked me to give her £5 for the privilege. This was obviously not the first time a tourist had been through here. Coming from the UK, I had clear expectations of Kenya. Lions and elephants, savannah plains, Maasai tribes, cities full of slums. Before now, I'd barely had any preconceptions on the trip. What to accept as Sudan, of Zambia. But Kenya was an archetype, the nation that represented the Africa of my childhood imagination. I paid the Maasai woman and took a photo. Then I focused on the road ahead. It didn't take long for my preconceptions to be confounded once again. Out of the jungle, a mountain appeared on the horizon. It wasn't a sandstone stack like those in Ethiopia, rather a grand snowy peak like the Matterhorn or Mont Blanc. Here, situated in the middle of green farmlands, was Mount Kenya, the second largest mountain in Africa, rising alone with vast craggy peaks iced with snow. The Maasai gave it the name God's Throne, and its appearance was suitably deified and unforgettable. Nate and I stopped for a picnic lunch in the foothills of the mountain. We ate cheese sandwiches, drank local Tusker beer, and discussed plans for the forthcoming cross-dressing party that was planned for the equator. "I never dressed in drag before," I said. "Any tips?" Nate considered the tight turquoise blue dress that I picked up from a local market. "Don't forget to cross your legs when you're sitting down," he suggested. We descended from Mount Kenya and reached the equator. There wasn't much there, aside from a sign and a few shops selling tourist junk. We cycled to our hotel campsite and prepared for the cross-dressing party. Nate looked pretty attractive in a gold-fringed bolero top and tight faux leather pants, while I looked like Margaret Thatcher in my dress. Most of the other cyclists joined the fun, and we spent the evening downing beers and throwing shapes to Lady Gaga and Taylor Swift. Late at night, Nate and I retired to the campsite, lay down together, and looked up at the stars. The moon was directly above and was surrounded by a circle of clouds. It was like the universe was spinning around us. "Do the clouds revolve like that because we're at the equator?" I asked Nate. "I think it's just because you're drunk," he said. The next day, we began a long, flat slog towards Nairobi. The landscape became urbanised with bizarre old colonial towns, tea shops, public schools, and vast retail estates. Cycling became more precarious by the mile. I've been warned of many dangers in Kenya: Al-Shabaab terrorists, AK-47 wielding bandits, lions and leopards. But as with most places in the world, the number one danger to cyclists were cars. Cycling along the main highway into Nairobi was a constant game of Russian roulette, with cars happy to drive on the other side of the road and head straight at you whenever it took their fancy. I went to take a photo of one such incident, stupidly, and managed to lose control and crash off the side of the road at high speed. I fell onto my side and lacerated my elbow. It bled a lot. Nate was on hand and formed a makeshift bandage, and more importantly, after a little straightening out, the Duchess was okay to continue riding. At lunch, our nurse, Jodie, gave the cut a clean, applied a strong plaster, and gave me the okay to keep going, on the proviso I had stitches at camp. Only in Africa. In Nairobi, we camped in a field next to a shopping mall, and as luck would have it, there was a private hospital on top of it. The mall was a place for white people to do their shopping outside of the dangers of the city, and as such, even healthcare was provided. The nurse gave me some stitches, wrapped my arm up in plaster, and prescribed me a week's worth of antibiotics. My bill was in American dollars rather than the local currency. After this, I took a quick afternoon to explore the city, but compared to Addis, it felt much more westernised, with office blocks, fast food restaurants, and traffic jams, as well as some vast shanty towns. With Western money came Western inequality. Nate spent the time meeting local LGBT activists and discussing their lives under the Anti-Sodomy Act, a relic of the colonial era. Suddenly, the wound on my arm did not feel like so much of a big deal. The entrance to Tanzania was another moment out of the Africa textbook. Zebras grazed by the side of the road. Maasai farmers led cattle across the fields. Mount Kilimanjaro sat on one side, Mount Meru the other. There was even a paved road for our enjoyment. It was cycling paradise. We had our passports stamped, stopped to the busy city of Arusha, and set up camp in the grounds of a hotel. There was now a 3-day rest to explore the wonders of northern Tanzania, and I was keen to make the most of it. Nate and I took a safari on the Serengeti. Although it was a shame to be off the bikes, as we crossed into the national park, it felt like we had been transported into Eden. Lions, elephants, giraffes, cheetahs, wildebeests, golden sunsets and grassy plains stretching out to infinity. The experience was like nothing else on Earth. We camped in the national park, the sounds of crickets and the occasional hyena echoing through the darkness. I was woken up in the middle of the night by an elephant wandering around our campsite. The true African experience. In the morning I woke up and noticed a strange swelling on my foot. It wasn't painful, but it was purple and made me feel woozy. I speculated as to whether it might be tsetse flies and I could have sleeping sickness, or it might be a mosquito and I could have malaria. I told our guide, who laughed into his coffee and told me to stop being a stupid white man. I agreed with him and thought nothing more of it. Tanzania was beautiful, but also had pockets of serious deprivation. Cycling out from the national parks, we noticed the first signs of true poverty. Families begged for food on the roadside, and locals gathered to scavenge leftovers when we stopped for lunch. In one village, there was a dead body on the side of the road. It seemed crazy, given all the rich tourists hovering around the Serengeti and the Masai Mara, but as always, the wealth did not go directly to the people. I learnt that 2/3 of the population lived below the poverty line, with 32% deemed as malnourished. Tanzania was also where the AIDS problem in Africa really started, with over 20% of the population infected, and the number growing by the year. The paved road we were cycling on may have provided economic benefits, but it was also the cause of the spread of the disease throughout rural areas. I had no doubt it was the reason for the roadside corpse. Soon we turned off the highway and started a long slog on a dirt road that would lead us straight to the Malawi border. Nate and I cycled together and chatted to keep ourselves sane. Our conversations ranged from the philosophical, is one day on the tour the same as a month in the real world, and what does that mean? The whimsical, why don't women find the idea of 2 men having sex as alluring as men find 2 women having sex? And the salacious, did you see the Canadian rider sneaking off to the tent with our driver? And aren't they both married? Alongside us, farms and villages gave way to tropical forests and cloudless skies, presenting vivid contrasts of blue, green, and deep orange. It felt like we were cycling through a surrealist painting, the Chirico landscape, where everything was rendered still, aside from the spinning of our wheels. The long dirt road was a meditative place to cycle. Without any distractions, we were able to take our time, interact with the people around us, and drink in the beauty of our surroundings. Weaver birds built vast nests in the trees. Fish eagles hovered above the canopy. Occasionally a snake slid over the road. Children in well-kept uniforms walked in long lines to school. Villagers played football long into the evening, interrupted occasionally by cattle running onto the pitch. After one game, there was an impromptu dance competition, and we joined in with gusto, causing much laughter with our unfamiliar moves, such as Big Fish, Little Fish, and the Macarena. The strange purple swelling in my foot had expanded and turned into a mixture of purple and bright red flesh. One lunchtime I took my sock off and asked Jodie if she could have a look. She drew a line around the swelling with a Sharpie pen. "Does it feel hot?" she asked. "I don't know," I said. "Everything feels hot." She frowned and prodded it with her finger. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "I don't know," I said. "Everything hurts." She rolled her eyes. "You're not being much help." Another of the riders, a doctor from Alaska named Mark, came over to have a look. He was a lugubrious individual, for whom every day seemed like a greater descent into a wallow of misery than the last, and I was not looking forward to his prognosis. "What do you think?" asked Jodie. "It's getting quite infected." Mark knelt down and closely inspected the swelling. "Did it start here?" he said, wrapping his hand around my ankle. "Yes." "And how long has it taken to move here?" "I don't know, about a week." He stroked the swollen red skin around my shin. "I don't like the look of this, Jodie. Do you have a large hypodermic needle?" "I can pick one up at the next border crossing." "It might be wise." I chose not to think about what this meant. The dirt road ended, and we began a long climb out of the Great Rift Valley. On the way up a winding mountain road, we passed a vast quarry, manned by Chinese workers and machinery. Dug into the side of the mountain, it resembled a scene from a James Bond movie. Workers in jumpsuits, large drills, piles of rubble, barbed wire, and aggressive signs telling us to stay away. Nate and I cycled by gingerly, trying not to make eye contact. Upwards was our only means of escape, and we were not going anywhere fast. We reached the summit and took a long look at the land beneath us. Tanzania was a panorama of colour: green, blue, splashings of red and orange. Over the mountain lay Lake Malawi and the warm heart of Africa. We cycled on. Malawi. Malawi was a burst of tropical green. The cooler temperatures and increased rainfall made for a lush, hilly land with rainforests, cultivated fields, and incredible biodiversity. We descended through the Masuku Hills towards the shores of Lake Malawi and felt our first sprinkling of rain on the trip. The area around the lake was populated with subsistence farms and fishing communities. There were many people walking the roadside, carrying pots, tools, or buckets of goodness knows what. Their clothing was ragged in comparison to the colourful fashions of Tanzania. However, they were equally outgoing. My pre-African judgment would be to think of this as a much poorer country. However, instead, I thought of it in terms of how Cornwall is to London. A more relaxed ethic, less consumer-driven, a coastal way of life, and a happier place as a result. I forgot to get my passport stamped and was accompanied on my ride back to the border by a man carrying a dead goat on the back of his bike. Despite not understanding a word he was saying, we conversed all the way and had a long handshake at the end. I then rode the next 40 miles to camp with more fellow cyclists for company, some carrying bundles of crops or wood, all happy to talk. The greenery of the small farms and trees and the fresh scent of water made for a pleasant afternoon. I reached camp and was met by Jodie, our nurse, waiting for me with a bottle of beer. "Cheers," I said. "Don't get too comfortable. Mark and I are going to operate on your leg after dinner. You might want to have a few more of those." I sat in the back of the truck with a bottle of Tusker. Nate joined and chatted to me while Dr. Mark prepared the surgical equipment. After taking me through the plan for the procedure, lance, drain, and hope for the best, he adjusted his glasses and then stuck a large needle in my leg. There was blood, pus, more blood, then a lot of pain. Jodie mopped up with bundles of cotton wool. Nate did his best not to be sick. Then we all had a large drink at the bar. I was now taking about 10 different pills a day: painkillers, malaria meds, anti-inflammatories, and antibiotics. I also had to have an additional shot of antibiotics injected into my arse every morning. Jodie would lie me down, poke the needle in, and then scrape any additional pus from my leg with a scalpel. Then it was breakfast. Oh, and 80 miles of cycling. To brighten the mood, we had a party on the shores of Lake Malawi. I dressed as a chameleon by wearing every item of clothing I had, and Nate dressed as a bee. We drank as much gin as our stomachs would allow, and then played games on the beach. I had a drunken snog with April, our chef on the trip, a Canadian artist with a slim build and long dreadlocks. One thing led to another, and I ended up with all my clothes scattered over the beach. The next morning I had to search for all the various coloured items in the sand. Note for future self: never dress as a chameleon on a beach. We climbed away from the lake and up to the Malawian highlands. The air freshened and the landscape transformed into a utopia of valleys, streams, rocky hills, and pastoral villages. Nate and I discussed sexuality and how our desires have fluctuated during the trip. "For the first month, I barely thought about sex," he said. "But now I'm like a rampant rabbit." "I'm the same," I said. "Maybe it's the humidity." For me, the idea of sex in this environment felt like a very normal, natural way to be. However, for Nate, it was much more complicated. Malawi had recently suspended its laws criminalising homosexuality, but then introduced new laws on marriage that banned all same-sex relations. It was another country that seemed to be going backwards rather than forwards. and another place where Nate's feelings and desires were deemed illicit. No one in the cycling group was outwardly gay, and hooking up with a local stud would be a complicated and potentially dangerous process. I always tell myself that at the end of a marathon, there will be someone waiting for me that I love at the end, I told him. And maybe that's what's going to happen on this trip as well. So you'll meet the woman of your dreams and get married and have kids and live happily ever after, said Nate. Something like that. Every LGBT person is still midway through that marathon, he told me. The world isn't quite ready for happy ever after. After a few days of rural cycling bliss, we descended back onto arable plains and the highway into Lilongwe. It felt safer than Nairobi, with only single carriageways and drivers who kept at least somewhat close to the speed limit. I didn't take any photos and kept my eyes firmly on the road. There was only one occasion when I took a risk, moving over to have a quick chat with Nate, when a car travelling at about twice the speed limit roared past and swiped me from the side. My bike flipped and I flew dramatically through the air. What next? I thought, before I struck the concrete back first, my cycle helmet smashing beneath me. Then I blacked out. A few moments later I came to find Nate and a few others gathered around me. "Are you okay?" he said, visibly panicked. "That guy was going so fast. I tried to move in, but there was no way you could have avoided him in time." I turned to the side and strained my eyes to the edge of the road. "That's okay. I don't think I'm paralysed or anything." There was only one thing that mattered. "Can you tell me," I croaked, my head starting to throb, Is the Duchess okay?" I rode on to lunch with Nate and told Jodie what had happened. She gave me a despairing look, then asked if my back and spine were okay. "I think so," I said. "I fell on my side, then rolled onto my back." "Well, you can stand up, so it can't be that bad." She gave my ribs the once over. I told her where it hurt and where it didn't. "You probably just had a couple of fractures. Nothing much we can do about those. And your head, is that all right?" "I broke my helmet," I said, "but I think everything else is okay." "You sure you're not dizzy or disorientated?" "No, I don't think so." "Well, we probably don't have time to drive you to a hospital, so put your bike on the roof and we'll drive you to camp." I took hold of the handlebars of the Duchess. "I think it's okay. The wheel's a bit bent, but I think I can make it another 20 miles. "I'm not worried about the bike, Ben. You can't ride after a head injury and not without a helmet." "But," she shook her head. "Get in the truck, Ben." I sat in the front seat and waved to Nate as we drove off into Lilongwe. Once we arrived, I found a shopping mall with a sports shop and bought myself a new cycle helmet. All set for riding the next day. In the evening, as a treat for no one dying, we all went for dinner at a posh restaurant. Any excuse. "Did I miss much on the road?" I asked Nate as we tucked into some gin and tonics. "Not really. Another presidential convoy approached us on the way into Lilongwe. The police weren't happy for us to ride at the same time and told us to wait on the side verge. Kevin, one of the other American cyclists, didn't seem to think this was okay and called the president a motherfucker as he drove past. He's now in jail and has a hearing tomorrow morning. Other than that, it was a pretty quiet afternoon." Kevin was a millionaire American with an abrasive nature to match. In Ethiopia, he tried to cause a mutiny in camp because we weren't getting enough protection from the kids throwing stones. He and his girlfriend cycled together on expensive bikes, drank disgusting protein shakes all day, and then had disgusting sounding sex in their tent in the evening. It couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. I'm going to his hearing tomorrow, said Nate. I hope they've let him change out of his spandex. We spent the rest of the night laughing about the antics of the American cyclists, and after a final G&T, my ribs hurt so much that I had to go home. Lilongwe is another city of contrasts. There are pristine tree-lined streets, walled mansions, private schools, then shacks and shanty towns a few hundred yards down the road. It had a brand new 40,000-seat stadium, built with a loan from the Chinese government, 5 or 6 shopping malls, and a shiny new parliament building, which, despite this being a multi-party democracy, we were not allowed to take photos of. We cycled out through the old town, a more traditional mix of thrift stores, stalls and markets, bustling with people, bikes and loud music. Then it was back onto the road towards the highway to Zambia. My ribs, gears and stomach somehow still holding together. Zambia and Botswana. So far on the trip, the African roads have been endlessly varied and entertaining. But from Lilongwe to Windhoek, it was a long, straight highway from one side of the continent to the other. The Zambian landscape began with lush forests and hills, but this soon dwindled to regulation grassland and scrub. I was still struggling with the injured ribs and the relentless doses of medication to keep my leg from infection. If it wasn't for the lingering presence of gigantic storm clouds on the horizon, I could have slept on the bike. Zambia was a sparsely populated country. What buildings there were mainly thatched huts, with the occasional stall selling coke and water. We were greeted with a "Hey you" or "Mzungu Mzungu" at each one we passed. Nate and I spent most of our time spotting birds, weavers, rollers, fish eagles, and the occasional secretary bird, and then hiding from rain showers. It was another return to the simple life. The flatlands gave my injuries a good time to heal, and by the time we reached the capital city of Lusaka, my energy levels were renewed. We checked into our hotel, set up our tents in the grounds, drank gin and tonics, and I resumed my physical relationship with April, hoping this would complete my uncomplicated life. Lusaka was a city of little note. There are a few high-rise buildings, a run-down CBD, and some modern malls with white people on the adverts. I spent my rest day eating fried eggs on toast, drinking milkshakes, and washing my disgusting cycling clothes, rather than sightseeing. Back on the road with Nate, I felt a strange sense of guilt. It was as if by having been with April, I had somehow cheated on him or done something bad. I started to realise that maybe my affection for him was becoming more than simple friendship, and that the openness of the tour experience, knowing all of our deepest physical and emotional feelings, understanding our strengths, weaknesses, tics and habits, had given us the shared intimacy of lovers. Nate knew things about me no one else did. I was sure it was the same for him. And that gave us a special bond. We discussed April briefly, then moved on to our usual pastimes of bird spotting, and deciding whether we'd shag, marry, or kill the other riders. Maybe I was overthinking it all, but I didn't want anything to come between us. Soon, Victoria Falls appeared on the horizon. Its local name is Mosi Owatunya, the smoke that thunders. And as the mist of the falls appeared far in the distance, it was clear how appropriate this title was. We cycled into the adjacent town, Livingston, an affluent outpost with boutique shops, palm trees and green verges, and set up camp in the grounds of one of the mock colonial hotels. Mzungus were everywhere, sipping on gin and tonics, talking loudly in American, German, and Chinese accents. I spent the evening in the hotel bar with April. We drank cocktails, then lay together on the sofa until we were eventually turfed out. She invited me back to her tent, but I felt reluctant and went back to my own to sleep. It still felt like I had more important relationships to maintain. We now had 2 days to rest, but being tour cyclists, our rest options of choice were whitewater rafting on the Zambezi, helicopter rides, and bungee jumps off a bridge over the falls. Mosi Owatunya was a spectacular sight. The full width of the Zambezi River plummeted in a single vertical drop into a chasm over a mile wide. Helicopters gave an idea of scale. Rafting made us feel the effects of the water. But there was no better view than standing on the bridge over the falls, watching the gargantuan cascade, hearing the roar, and feeling awestruck and insignificant by the scale of it all. Africa had humbled us once again. The next stage of the tour was nicknamed the Elephant Highway. Botswana has the largest concentration of African elephants in the world, and true to form, the moment we crossed the border, an elephant appeared out of the bush. I stopped quickly and took out my camera, while Nate stopped and fell out of his cleats and onto the road. The elephant darted back into the bush, outsmarted by animals once again. Botswana is also one of the world's most sparsely populated countries. It is about the size of France, but is only home to around 2 million people. Many areas are protected national parks or reserves, significantly the Chobe National Park in the east and the Central Kalahari Game Reserve in the west. The land is mainly scrub and bush. It was not the most exciting for cycling, but paradise for wildlife. Groups of elephants wandered over the road, giraffes clustered around our lunch stop, and warthogs scuttled alongside our bikes. At the campsite, we even heard lions growling in the darkness. Maybe not everyone was so happy to see us. Over the long, flat central road, Nate and I discussed the fate of the local Sam people, or the Bushmen, as they were popularly known. This were an indigenous group who had maintained a subsistence life in the country for millennia, but had recently been displaced by farming or redistribution of land to white settlers. Nate talked of his experience in South Africa and the need for continued positive discrimination to rebalance the racial divide. Is it not better for people to not think about colour and to treat everyone the same? I said. You have obviously not lived in Southern Africa, he said. Botswana's flat, meditative roads gave me time to think. What was I learning on this trip? How was it changing me as a person? I thought of a short story I'd read in my tent the night before. It told of a woman on her deathbed, dying from an uncertain cause, possibly malnutrition, or possibly from a life of bedding foreign men. Her 3 children come to visit her. The oldest looks at her with pity. The woman tells her that she has saved riches for her, and that if she is smart, she will know what to do with them. Then she sees the middle daughter, who has dyed hair, bleached skin, and high street clothes. She tells her that whatever she does, she will always be African. Then she sees the youngest, with a Chinese symbol tattooed on her shoulder. She tells her that China has changed nothing, aside from introducing more mismanagement and corruption, and a world ruled by dictators. She gathers all the children together and tells them to remember who they are, that this is still a proud continent, and that it can still be this way. The 3 look at her sadly, then one by one leave the room. No one listens to Mother Africa anymore. We cycled on into the Kalahari Desert. It was more of a barren scrub rather than the sweeping sands of the Sahara, and had none of the serenity. Our days were long, 150 kilometres, 200 kilometres, and the cycling became challenging once again. At night there were epic thunderstorms, leaving our campsite a quagmire and sleep difficult. Even the wildlife had disappeared, aside from the occasional hornbill or weaver. Nate and I cycled in silence, pushing through the miles and letting our legs do the talking. It was tough, but there was nothing we could do to change things, or would have wanted to. Every day was still better than sitting in an office. We reached the Namibian border after a 200-kilometre ride and bought ourselves as many chocolate bars as we could find. Another country down, only 2 to go. Africa was deep inside us. Namibia and South Africa. Only 2 countries to go, I said to Nate, as we waited for our passports to be checked. I'm starting to feel like we're going to make it. Nate looked less confident. Namibia's just desert, right? I said. We've done that. And then South Africa's easy. We've got to take the Trans-Kalahari Highway into Windhoek, he said. The most dangerous road in Africa. And I don't think there's much paved surface until Cape Town. Oh, good, I said. Apart from that, though. Oh, yeah, no problem. Although Namibia is hot. The most dangerous road in Africa is quite an accolade, but the Trans-Kalahari did not disappoint. It was a single-lane highway with a speed limit of 120 kilometres an hour and no hard shoulder. No one cycles on it, so the truck drivers do not even look for bikes on the road. And most of the time, even if they do see you, they don't stop. In scenes reminiscent of Terminator 2, huge black rigs approached Nate and I from behind, sounded their horns, and careered straight for us at high speed. The only way to avoid being crushed to death was to throw our bikes off the road and jump out of the way. On a large patch of desert, this was fine, but on the hills outside of Windhoek, with steep curves and blind bends. It was almost suicidal. We made it, just, although I was a nervous wreck by the end. Nate bought me a strong beer and an ice cream. Any excuse. Windhoek was an opulent oasis of bars, hotels, and dodgy money, which meant a soothing drink or 8 was not far away. We tucked into beer, Jägermeister, and pork knuckles in a German restaurant called Joe's Beer House, and toasted to staying alive. Any excuse once again. The next day we cycled sore-headedly out of the city, and as promised the paved road quickly ran out. We were back on the dirt and sand for a slow slog through the Namib Desert, and the most stunning stretch of the ride. The Namib is the oldest desert in the world and one of the most beautiful places on earth. The white gravel of the road contrasts with pristine golden sand dunes and large rocky edifices that grow in amber light. The sky was perfect blue, and nothing moved aside from the occasional zebra or antelope. Here was my dream of cycling through Africa, and perhaps my dream for life. After a few days we reached Sestrium, a small outpost on the side of the most spectacular dunes in the desert. I had a drink at the bar, then spent the rest of the night with another bout of gastroenteritis. The next day we took a bouncy jeep ride up to the biggest of all the dunes and climbed up to watch the sunrise. The desert ebbed and flowed on the horizon, igniting orange in the morning light. It was a sight to reinvigorate any lost energy. Back at camp, April prepared a homeopathic remedy for my gastro. I had no idea what it was, but after spending another few hours on the toilet, I was immediately cured. The desert also meant that we were out of malaria country, so the next morning I was able to start the day without taking any drugs for the first time in 3 months, aside from a large cup of caffeine-heavy coffee. The landscape became ever more beautiful by the day, a world of rippling sand and monolithic rocks. It was like riding into a pre-human existence, old and wise, with ingrained knowledge of Homo sapiens, dinosaurs, and the creation of life, somewhere deep in the orange sandstone. As our last desert campsite, I sauntered back to my tent in the middle of the night and saw Nate about to go to bed. Before zipping up his tent, he stopped and took a long look at the stars. Then, happy with the world once again, opened up his tent and went to sleep. It was that night that I understood what this journey was all about. Not love of exercise, or pushing myself, or trying to find a different life. It was about finding love for someone else and realising how happy that could make me feel. Maybe sometime in the afterlife, this is where I go. Somewhere in the Namib Desert, Nate cycling beside me, and the universe stretching out to infinity. We crossed the border into South Africa and were met with unfamiliar scenes of supermarkets, coffee shops, and people rushing around talking on phones. It didn't feel like somewhere I wanted to be or could ever come back to. It didn't feel real. The final 700 miles of the trip began on a South African highway, but due to police recommendations for our safety, we were quickly led onto a dirt road and back to the wilderness. The idea of South Africa as an urban metropolis quickly dissipated, and we were soon in scrubland more barren than any so far. It felt good to be away from the cars, but the sand and dirt were physically breaking us with every pedal. The next morning, spirits were low. Our tour leader told us that nothing would change, and if anything, the roads were going to get worse. The highlight of the day is a graveyard, she said, if you manage to see it. We were cycling through Bushman land, an area north of the Great Karoo and south of the Kalahari Desert. It was a place noted for being even more desolate and arid than its surroundings, which was quite an achievement. There was one nature reserve, Valputs. However, this was a reserve in the same way Chernobyl is a reserve. It's where South Africa dumps its nuclear waste. Were there animals actually living here? I'm not sure I would have liked to have run into them if there were. Nate and I cycled as best we could, pushing our way through the sediment, carefully negotiating gravel slopes and slogging through bogs of sand. The heat was oppressive again, and there was little to talk about apart from how much we weren't enjoying our time. At one point, around 10 kilometres from camp, Nate stopped behind me. I could hear him shouting, but I was 50 yards ahead and didn't particularly want to listen. I should have turned back, but instead I rode on, desperate to make it into camp. I finished, then Nate cycled in half an hour after me, cut and bruised from falling off. His face told me that the pain was okay, but that the worst injury was being let down by his best friend. I look back on this with shame now, but I can see how it happened. I had to keep going, otherwise I felt like I wouldn't make it. The terrible selfishness of the endurance athlete. Later, Nate and I made up, and he conceded that in the opposite circumstances, he might well have done the same thing. The next morning, we were cycling back through the dirt together. It was hard once again, but our spirits were renewed, and we made it through without incident. It was then a steep climb through the Cederberg Mountains, a range of dramatic dark red peaks around 200 kilometres north of the coast. They were mostly sandstone, but as the altitude increased, there were bursts of blues, greens and reds, trees and wildflowers sprouting celebratory out of the rocks. For one last time, the mountain goats could leap up the passes and descend in their usual tentative manner, aware that it was too close to the end to fall off now. As we rode further south, the colours turned to autumnal golds and browns, and the route descended through orchards, vineyards, and tiny villages straight out of Don Quixote. The world was alive and benevolent once again. We made it to Malmesbury, and all of a sudden, we're only an 80-kilometre ride away from Cape Town. Somewhere in the distance was the ocean, not seen since all those days ago on the east coast of Egypt. My bike, the Duchess, was making more clunks and clangs than a marching band in an earthquake. I was just hoping that it would make it through the last stretch. The final day was a mix of excitement and sadness. Everyone wanted to finish, but no one wanted the trip to end. The cycling bubble had been one of perfect liberation. No bills, no work, no responsibilities, which only left two things to discover: Africa and ourselves. Whilst I was experiencing the former, it was amazing how much the latter came out. Hard cycling, sickness, heat, shared toilets, exhaustion, and camaraderie meant we had to express ourselves with no barriers. What came out who we were, warts and all. For me, that felt like a pretty good person. I liked it, and other people liked it too. I wanted to make sure I stayed like this for good. We reached Cape Town, and my bike creaked like an arthritic kangaroo. I had a cycle helmet from Malawi, stitches in my arm from Kenya, a scar from the spider bite in the Serengeti, stomach ravaged by Ethiopian bugs, and skin caked by the Sudanese sun. Africa was a part of all of us now, every fucking inch, and would stay with us forever. Nate and I cycled together into the harbour. We held our bikes aloft in front of Table Mountain, and then embraced for a long time. We survived, I said. We made it together, he said. I couldn't have done it without you. I wouldn't have wanted to do it without you. We broke apart and then stopped and took a moment together. I don't want this to end, I said silently. Neither do I. As long as I'm with you, I can go anywhere. As long as I'm with you, I feel like I'm home. Should we go and find a bar? Said Nate. I think the Simon and the Duchess could do with a rest. I came for an adventure and found someone who loved me and who I loved back. It wasn't what I expected, but maybe all I really wanted. Nate and I got back on our bikes and rode together into the city. A new adventure about to begin.